Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back in our episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have 6 LGBTQ Minnesotans speak out amid ICE crackdowns from unclosetedmedia.com, posted by Knee Concussions, and they said, death threats, bomb threats, people coming into the teachers' houses and knocking on the doors and running away. They had to bring the dogs in, so my kid didn't even get to go to school for 2 weeks, and now they're back in school in a secret location. Like, this is the fucking Taliban that we're hiding from. I guess that was a quote from her article, and the OP added, this Minneapolis resident smokes a blunt. She speaks to Uncloseted Media and panel 5 of her queer folks from the city as they speak of hope, burnout, fear, and resistance dice following the orders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And yeah, personally, I definitely do think, Minnesota is definitely kind of a war zone right now. But with that being said, I'm tired of all these people constantly looking at this from like an identity politics angle. I don't know why their sexuality is relevant here. But the OP worked for this outlet. They've shared articles they've written for them in the past, so that might be why they're sharing it. But regardless, I think people are tired of the constant LGBTQ whatever letters they've added, as well as circle jerk. If you want to focus on the LGBTQ whatever letters they've added as well community and read about them, that's fine. But personally, it's very much an annoying to me and a lot of other people that you can't look at someone beyond their sexuality or gender identity. If you want to if you want to just focus on people because they're LGBTQ, that's fine. But I personally think you should be focusing on people not just because of what race or gender or sexuality they are, but rather their experiences. This does appear to be focusing mostly on their experiences, but they only care about them because they're LGBTQ. If they weren't LGBTQ, they wouldn't be covering it. And it just goes to show you that I think people are too obsessed with their identity politics these days, both on the right and on the left. I would say mostly on the left, but the right are becoming more obnoxious about as well in regards to like white rights and Christian rights and all that. And that's why I think we should leave that behind in the 2010s rather than keep doing it forever. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have Jeffrey Epstein files. Don't be fooled. Millions of files are still unreleased from TheGuardian.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I think the Epstein files is something people are never going to be satisfied with. They'll always say there's going to be more files to be released because, ultimately they can put as much out there as they want to, and they're never going to ultimately, lead to any convictions since the elite class is on the top tier of the two-tier justice class, while the peasants like us are on the bottom tier. And if we were on Epstein Island, we'd go to prison for life, but since the elites were on there, it doesn't really matter. And also because, another reason there won't be any consequences is because Epstein was very likely a Mossad agent, the Mossad very being Israel's version of the CIA, and they used him to gather dirt on the elites, and that's why that's probably why there also won't be any consequences, because Israel is very much the one running the show, and they don't want any consequences for their puppets because they're the ones who ultimately control a lot of U.S. politics, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have popular YouTube channel Technology Connections does an incredible analysis and expose on solar power tech and why it is truly world-changing, which also illuminates some of our society's most challenging problems. A must-watch, especially the end, from YouTube.com, posted by Mundane Image 13, and that's across posts from the Free Thought subreddit. And that's a YouTube video from Technology Connections. You are being misled about renewable energy. And yeah, personally, I think if people want to do renewable energy, they should be able to, do whatever energy sources you want to. If you want to think if they're effective or not, that might depend on the weather or something. But ultimately, I think everyone should be able to do their own technology source, and it shouldn't be backed by the government. That's why a lot of Redditors complain, oh, Trump's cutting wind power because he says the windmills don't work and they kill birds. And that's why, I think all energy, like everything else, should be private in the private sector rather than the public sector. And yeah, that's why I would say you shouldn't have government control over it, at least. So if you want to be for renewable energy and promote renewable energy, you should be able to. Personally, I'm not as into it as a lot of people are, but, do whatever you want, and that's very much libertarian perspective as long as you're not hurting anyone else. Next we have, remember, the pendulum always swings, posted by Appropriate Share 47, and that's some looks like some MS Paint trolling, and it's an ICE officer who says "mup to do dee da poo," some gibberish. And then the guy in the MAGA caps on the ground with a bunch of bullet holes in him, he says, "I voted for this." And yeah, it's a very Reddit political cartoon. Reddit always is going to circle jerk whatever its position is. I don't personally care for ICE, but, Reddit only cares for that ICE is going after them. If ICE was going after MAGA, like this picture indicates, Reddit would think they're the greatest thing ever, and that just goes to show you that, for a lot of people, politics is nothing more than in-group good, out-group bad, rather than having any consistent values or principles. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump calls into Bongino's radio show and calls for the federal government to take over elections in 15 states, from Imgur.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's across posts from the underreported news subreddit. And that looks like a tweet from Aaron Rupar. Trump, these people were brought to our country to vote and they vote illegally. The Republicans should say we should take over the voting at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. We have states that I won that show that I didn't win. You're going to see something in Georgia. And yeah, personally, if Trump wants to say that, that's fine. But I think the libertarian perspective is, the election should be run by the states first and foremost. But, ultimately, if the government does want to nationalize them, ultimately, they have the monopoly and legal force to justify whatever they feel like. And yeah, personally, I think the ultimate libertarian position is we shouldn't have any forced collectivist elections. We should only have voluntary collectivist elections. If people want to have a voluntary commune and have elections in that, I think that's fine. But right now, you're forced to obey whoever wins the election, whether you like it or not. And that's not something that I think the libertarians should support. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have polyamory isn't legally protected in the U.S. Why? From unclosetedmedia.com, posted by Knee Concussions, and they added, millions of polyamorous Americans remain legally unprotected, leaving poly relationships vulnerable to employment and housing discrimination, excluded from medical and family decision-making. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for polyamory or whatever any other terms you might use for it, like polygamy, cucking, etc., etc. But, ultimately, if people want to do that, I think they should be able to. I think the libertarian perspective is, polyamorous people, if they want to have their marriages legally recognized, ultimately, I think libertarian perspective on marriage is we should have the state out of marriage rather than have the state determine which marriages are valid or not. In a lot of ways, I think same-sex marriage wasn't going far enough. There's nothing that states marriage has to be monogamous, I would say. But I think the libertarian perspective is get the state out of marriage altogether and let people decide what counts as marriage on their own terms rather than have the state define it for them. As I said earlier, I personally am much more into monogamy than polyamory, polygamy, cucking, whatever else whatever terms they use. But, if you want to do that, that's on you. And I think, you should be able to consider that legit, even if the state says otherwise. And I think that's why the libertarian position is we gotta get the state out of marriage. And, also, this person's arguing that leaving polyrelations vulnerable to employment and housing information. Ultimately, I think employment and housing information should be up to the employer and the house, respectively, rather than the state. It's interesting. A lot of Redditors hate government authoritarianism, but they suddenly love it when it's used to enforce stuff like employment and housing discrimination, and that's something that I think is important to remember as well. They just want the government to control what they want it to be control, rather than be free from government altogether. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have MAGA adult male assaults Texas high school students protesting ICE, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the ICE Raid Alert subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think you should be assaulting high school students, but this is very much another instance, I think, of Reddit saying, trying to create a narrative and put it ahead of the facts. I think I saw some people saying that one of the girls, the students, stole his hat first, and then he tried to get back from her, and then they all kind of jumped on him. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit, was only about, I'm not saying that's exactly what happened. Maybe it might have been different. But, if it did happen, Reddit only cares what the narrative is rather than what actually happened. I personally don't really care for MAGA, but, just because someone's MAGA doesn't mean that the NAP doesn't apply to them. You shouldn't be stealing their hat or otherwise beating them up if ultimately though, people are going to justify what they justify. Personally, I would disagree. I would probably stay, if I was the MAGA guy, I would stay far away from these students. They're only going to get you in trouble if you try and interact with them. Just kind of like ICE or any government agency. Just so that's my thoughts there. Next, we have the people of Minneapolis have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, the first time the city's population has ever been nominated, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the current events subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that, and it looks like some kind of news, there's a video from it, I guess. And yeah, personally, I think if they want to nominate the citizens of Minneapolis for the Nobel Peace Prize, I think that's fine. But ultimately, I think the Nobel Peace Prize is very much an elite circle jerk. Obama won it right after he got elected president simply for not being George W. Bush, and then Trump got obsessed with it, and he had the Venezuelan woman who actually wanted to turn the award over to him. And it just goes to show you that I think we should move beyond subjective prizes and actually care more about objectivity. If they want to award the people of Minneapolis the Peace Prize, that's fine. But ultimately, it's just very much an elite circle jerk, just like a lot of other award shows are, like the Grammys, Oscars, Emmys, etc., etc. Next, we have House Speaker welcomes Trump call to take over elections, claimed Dems wins appear fraudulent, from democracydocket.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for elections in the first place, but someone's going to have to control them. Of course, Reddit doesn't like Trump to control them. I'm sure if it was a Democrat version of Trump that was obnoxiously progressive, Reddit would love it. And I think the libertarian perspective are, we should have local and state elections rather than big nationalized elections, but ultimately, when it comes to the elections, the government's running them so they can justify running them however they feel like. And I personally think that's why we shouldn't have elections in the first place, because they're going to be inherently subject to who's ever running them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have protest privacy / security, posted by USAF Muzzlefucker, and they added, if you are involving yourself in constitutionally protected but politically sensitive activities, i.e. ICE observers, protests, etc., are you doing one of the following: using your white and or personal everyday cell phone for organization of these protected activities, taking in the open over your secure signal such Discord chat, meaning using uncoded or overly simply coded language, contaminating different compartments of crosstalk, i.e. go to the other device, use a special channel. There you are at security risk to allow yourself and your fellow activists. The recent NYT article about ICE surveillance capabilities should be a wake-up call, and you need to get serious about infosec/opsec/comsec 0.02 deposited. And I would agree with that. If you should try and keep things under wraps if you are going to get involved with all the ICE stuff, because they could probably monitor your phones and all that. Personally, I wouldn't get involved in the first place. If it's interesting how a lot of Redditors say, oh, ICE literally Gestapo, yet they try to actively get involved with them as much as possible in stopping them. And it just goes to show you that, if they were as dangerous as Reddit said they were, they probably wouldn't be justifying going after them 24/7. But regardless, I do agree that if you are going to go after them, you should probably try and keep it as encrypted and private as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff got orders from Israel on how the U.S. should negotiate with Iran, total surrender, why are foreign agents dictating America's foreign policy and pushing us towards a forever war, posted by Row Run Row. And that's the headline from the Times of Israel. Israel push for U.S. demand the Iran give up nuclear program, missiles, proxies report. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Israel, but, ultimately the government, as it's shown with all the Epstein stuff, is pretty much in their pockets. So ultimately, if the government wants to sell out to Israel and do whatever they say, ultimately sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts there. And there's another post I want to share from the LPUS subreddit I originally posted it to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, but they removed it because, Reddit's just obsessed with censorship at this point. I just wasn't going to complain too much. Libertarian Party USA subreddit does let 95% of my stuff stay up usually, so that's good for them, and it's unlike the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit, which is like claiming to be uncensored, has had me banned for almost 2 years now. and that's not something I personally care for. And even then, the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit is still probably one of the better subreddits altogether when it comes to how its moderation. Reddit's moderation is literally that bad at this point. They'll ban you for any dissent at all. It's literally like 1984 almost, pretty much. If you ever dissent against Big Brother, you might as well you're basically unpersoned. Regardless, I shared this post to Libertarian Party Tuesday where I said libertarian perspective on stereotypes. And I said, so John Stossel, one of the greatest libertarian content creators at the moment, I dropped this video this morning going over the difference between men and women. Personally, I do think there are some genuine biological differences between males and females, especially when it comes to physical strength, but I definitely think a lot of the differences between sexes, genders can be traced to stereotypes and people trying to fulfill them as much as possible. I think that if possible, people want to try and fulfill or not fulfill stereotypes of groups that they are a part of, that they should be able to do so, but it's important to remember that the libertarian perspective is to people and individuals first and foremost rather than the groups they are a part of. People do want to focus on the groups they're a part of first and foremost, so you'd be able to do this too, though. People do tend to gravitate towards those who are most like themselves. It's why you end up places like Dearborn, Michigan, which has a Muslim majority, at the very least very close to it, or Curiosity Well, New York, which has an Orthodox Jewish majority. Thoughts? And personally, if you want to think that it's most genetics, I think that's fine as well. Believe whatever you want to. I think environmental factors are much more important currently. You shouldn't be treating science as gospel, especially when it comes to genetics. You don't want to sound like one of the follow science COVIDians, do you? If you want, science can be manipulated to fit any narrative. If you want to manipulate it to fit your narrative, that's fine. But you always gotta keep questioning. I personally am always been more on the nurture side rather than the nature side when it comes to genetic differences. And that's my thoughts there. But ultimately, believe whatever you want to, I would say. And that's my thoughts there. So we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.